So I've been playing tabletop RPGs for a few years now. When I was in high school, about a freshman, I was taught the very, very basics of Dungeons and Dragons or D&D. It wasn't until much later, like about when I was a senior in high school, that I would attempt to play D&D again, and that's kind of when I fell more in love. I loved it when I was a freshman, but not to the extent that I liked it when I was a senior in high school. I had fell face first into Dungeons and Dragons and kind of found myself as a dungeon master. For those who don't know, within Dungeons and Dragons, the DM or the dungeon master is the person at the table who's like in control of the story, or is like their whole job is to tell the story, essentially. And the DM's job is essentially to craft the story and make the monsters or decide the monsters that the other players face and that type of thing. Kind of like an omniscient narrating force in the world or at the table. So I found myself being the DM, and when I got back into Dungeons and Dragons, I found myself in this position as a storyteller. I'm a storyteller naturally. I'm a writer, which is one of the reasons I study English on the master's level as well as religion. But I found myself reflecting on life through the games, and this is because I was a storyteller. Not to say that the players aren't also storytellers. A good game of D&D, everybody at the table should be taking part in telling the story, not just the DM. If the DM is the only one telling a story in D&D, the DM might as well just write a book. The goal of Dungeons and Dragons is to tell a collective story from everyone at the table. The Dungeon Master just kind of establishes the setting and decides everything related to the setting, not related to the characters. Not related to the playable characters. That's what the players do. The NPCs or the non-playable characters, the DM does kind of control, but also must interact with the playable characters using the NPCs, and that is that collaborative world-building element. Anyway, so as I found myself in the role of like being a DM over the last few years, I've learned a lot about life through D&D, and this is because D&D mirrors life in a bunch of different ways, being the nature of a role-playing game. And I thought that I was the only one who kind of noticed how D&D reflects life. Turns out I'm very much not. A few months ago, I came across this self-help book that's about D&D. I still got the sticker on it because I've only skimmed it. I haven't read it. I should probably read it, but I didn't want to accidentally steal ideas from it while making this video, so it's only been skimmed. But obviously, I'm not the only one who has noticed that Dungeons & Dragons kind of reveals some deeper truths about life through being a tabletop game. Eventually I'll read that self-help book, but while skimming, I've noticed that like me and whoever wrote that book kind of noticed a few more things. That person's a lot older, so they've noticed a little bit different things than I have, but some of the same things. But it's really through D&D that I thought about failure in life. Failure is a key aspect of life, and you'll never go through life without failing or experiencing some type of failure, of course. And similarly, Dungeons & Dragons, a key part of it is also failure, which is kind of the nature of any gamer story. You can't really have a story without there being stakes, and you can't really have stakes without there being the possibility of failure, and you can't really have the possibility of failure within a story without knowing that the character has failed before. That's just storytelling 101. So failure in D&D kind of is necessary, but failure in D&D takes a different shape because unlike a video game or a book, failure in D&D holds a different weight because it kind of mirrors real life in very specific ways. And I want to kind of explore that in this video. So, to explain more about Dungeons & Dragons, it's important to understand what Dungeons & Dragons is. Dungeons & Dragons is a tabletop RPG, or a TTRPG, and I believe it's the first TTRPG to ever exist. A tabletop RPG, for those who don't know, is similar to a board game in the sense that you're usually sitting around a table, face to face with people you know, but there isn't a board. Like there's not spaces. It's not like Monopoly. mostly just imagination. There's maps at best made by the dungeon master. But it's like a board game in the sense that like you're interacting with real people, usually in a physical space. I say usually because technically it can be done on Discord and Zoom nowadays, and there's now like Dungeons and Dragons online stuff, like you can make maps and stuff online that can be played through with online, and very complicated. But usually Dungeons and Dragons is similar to a board game, but also similar to a video game, because a lot of video games are made after D&D. So Dungeons and Dragons was created by a man named Gary Gygax. I'm pretty sure his name is a little longer than that, but I'm just going to call him Gary Gygax because that's what everyone knows him as. And he's a very interesting man who will not be discussed in this video. I do not have the time to cover a very complex and controversial person. If you want to do a deep dive on Gary Gygax, I suggest you start with his opinions on women, because they were not great. But Gygax kind of built D&D, obviously based off of Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings being kind of the archetypical fantasy novel. Therefore, every piece of fantasy media, whether it be TV show, novel, anime, video game, kind of roots back to Lord of the Rings, and therefore roots back to like mythology. But that's also a video for another day. I say that a lot. A video for another day. Lots of videos. But essentially, D&D is built off of Lord of the Rings, and there's some complicated legal matters that happen because of that, and that's also an interesting topic that is really funny, that Tolkien's estate sued Dungeons and Dragons. Anyway, the game's core like needs is really just to have players and dice, and the dice is arbitrary. Like, now that you can just ask Siri to roll a d20. A d20 is a 20-sided die. And D&D is known for having these different types of die that are unusual to the regular board game. Most board games have like 6-sided die. D&D has like a 20-sided die, 10-sided die, so on and so forth. And there's players and a DM. And I've already explained the job of a DM, but again, the job of a DM is to essentially help facilitate the story. The players' jobs, on the other hand, is to move the story forward. They're the actual players of the game. So, essentially, the player's job is to make characters, and this includes picking a class, which is kind of like your job in the world, and this ranges from like barbarian to wizard. The player also needs to make a backstory for the character, decide what the character does, decide the goals of the character, the religion of the character, so on and so forth. And if you're thinking, hey, this is similar to like Bloodborne or any other fantasy video game, I have some news for you. Most fantasy video games are based off of Dungeons and Dragons. Like, Dungeons and Dragons is kind of the first game that creates this idea of classes, character classes, and stats, and all of this stuff that is kind of commonplace in most fantasy games, including like the most niche fantasy game that only exists in Japan is based off Dungeons and Dragons, whether you want to acknowledge that or not. So, the idea of the character class is very common in video games because of Dungeons and Dragons. And you also see other things in Dungeons and Dragons that are just staples of the fantasy genre, so like monsters, fighting monsters, politics, and by politics, usually specifically the politics specifically of monarchies. Usually you have a lot of kings and queens. If it's a D&D game set in the Middle East, you might have a stereotypical depiction of like a sultan, or if it's, I don't know, in a stereotypical depiction of like Africa, you might have a chief, but it's usually some type of monarchy-esque system, which a sultan and a chief are usually monarchy-esque, and it depends, though. But you have politics, D&D worlds, you have religion, fantasy as a genre is deeply intertwined with religion conceptually. Goes back to J.R.R. Tolkien and the fact that he's a Catholic, and the fact that Lord of the Rings has a lot of Catholic allegories in it, and a few other things that make the fantasy world itself. But D&D is a little more flexible and can follow whatever themes and goals the DM and the players want. At its core, D&D is a communal experience, and by that I mean it's one in which the players and the DM get together to tell a story of their own choosing. And this is important because essentially D&D has the opportunity to deeply influence and affect the players at the table. So imagine yourself as the DM if you can. If you don't have experience with D&D, that might be difficult, but imagine yourself at the head of the table telling a story. And imagine you're the DM running a story about a war between two nations. And one of your players at the table is from a war-torn country. So the story can be very therapeutic for someone who's from a war-torn countries to like reflect on the nature of war and trauma and so on and so forth. And you get the opportunity to explore that with your friend who is the player, or they can explore that themselves, and it can be helpful in many ways if done right. Everything can be done wrong and be awful. Keep that in mind. But your game could also, let's say, be about found family and can get players who are queer or traumatized people, allow them to heal in a sense. That is kind of the power of D&D. D&D has a very diverse audience, and it's used to not be that way. When it first started, when it was Gary Gygax, man, like I said, those opinions about women, let me tell you, it used to not be very diverse. But now it is a very diverse group. There's lots of queer people, lots of people of different races, people of color, different gender identities, and a very diverse audience, which is a good thing. Old D&D players, D&D is very complex. With anything that is old, you'll have a bunch of people going, I don't like the fact that this is diverse. But it has a very diverse audience now, and that's because of the power of D&D that I just described. You have the opportunity to experience some really therapeutic and healing experiences through D&D. Many queer people use D&D to experiment with identity. For example, they may play a character of the opposite sex, or play a gay character, or play a genderless character. And because of the nature of D&D, all the players at the table have to refer to you by your character's pronouns, not by your pronouns. So you can experiment without letting people know you're experimenting, and all the NPCs will call you your character's pronouns, your pronouns based off appearance usually, because that's kind of the nature of the game. You can kind of experiment that way. You can experiment with different types of backstories that kind of can reflect your own past in a way, and possibly live out moments differently. And you have so many options through D&D. D&D can be a way for people to let their anger go through the game without expressing it negatively in real life by playing like an evil character. There's so much potential with D&D and what D&D can do for people. But no matter the experiences or the stories or the people or the players, there's gonna be failure. As in most games, you can fail in D&D, but in this case, the DM plays a large part in that failure. So being a fantasy-based game, like I said earlier, fighting monsters tends to be a large part of the game, or at least fighting something. And the DM determines what monsters you fight and when, and usually the DM uses pre-made stat blocks, which is like pre-made statistics such as how strong the monster is, how fast it attacks, when it attacks, the speed of the monster, so on and so forth. Usually the DM uses pre-made monsters, which is made by the D&D company, which is Wizards of the Coast. They also make a card game called Magic the Gathering. And Wizards of the Coast releases these huge D&D books that are usually like $60. And they contain monsters and settings and NPCs and all types of stuff that is pre-made, that meant to help people speed the creative process up, in a sense. But the DM also can refuse to use pre-made monsters and do what's called homebrewing, which is where you make your own monster. It's also kind of just when you make your own stuff in general, like you make your own monsters, your own setting, your own magic, your own whatever. That's called homebrewing. And DMs have the ability to do this. But what's important is, in D&D, fighting is a large part of the game, and dying is a possibility. And when a player character dies, a player character, of course, being the character of a player, I'd probably Didn't have to explain that, but I just wanted to, just in case. When a player character dies, that character is dead forever because D&D is a story. So essentially, when a player character dies in combat, they die in the story. It's kind of how D&D just operates, right? And there are a few spells that can kind of bring a character back to life, but if you don't have them, or if you're not the level where you get them, the character is just dead, and the player has to make a new character. And this kind of means that the wrong action can result in the player being forced to create another character and to part with a previous one. You know, and sometimes people play with characters for months or even years. Some D&D games go on for years. Do not misunderstand me when I say years. Literally years. You can look it up. People have been playing, some D&D games are like 20 years old, you know. But within that, many characters die all the time, and you're forced to make a new character. But D&D is a role-playing game, so the other characters must react to the death of your character because they've been together. You know, that's the nature of the role-playing element. That's the story. So death is a huge part of D&D. You know, out of game, the death of a character usually causes the whole group to like break a level of immersion or step back, because everyone at the table knows what that means. You have to make a new character, and some people may even think the DM may have made this too hard, because usually the DM's goal is to not kill characters. Depending on the DM, some people really want to kill your character. Do not play with people like this. That's neither here nor there. But it kind of breaks this level of immersion where, you know, you recognize that whoever character died has spent a long time building up this character and now has to start all over. So there's an out-of-game element, but in-game, the characters are now affected by the death of this other character. They just watch the comrade die, in a sense. This is failure in D&D. The idea of a character dying, or the possibility of a character dying, hangs over most characters, or at least it should be. They try to play very carefully so characters don't die. You know, that's kind of part of the point of a game in general. But, you know, most people know that the death of a player character will affect the player emotionally or even in terms of labor. You know, it takes like 20 minutes to make a D&D character. And yet death happens often in D&D games, and can force the player to take an opportunity to make a new character because they don't really have another choice. And this demonstrates the nature of failure. Let's say a player is working through some trauma with a character named Kevin. This is the character they made. And Kevin's goal is to hunt down someone who has wronged them. This person is named Emily. And let's say Kevin dies in battle before even reaching Emily. And this death kind of can give the player an unfulfilled feeling, for Kevin didn't reach his goal. Kevin died before meeting Emily. But it also gives the player an opportunity to explore different aspects of vengeance. So let's say the player makes another character, and this character is Emily's sister, Vivian. Vivian is also looking for Emily, and in an attempt to stop Emily from wronging more people, Vivian wants to get to Emily first, before anyone who wants to kill Emily can. This allows the DM and the player to explore a more nuanced reality of vengeance, more complex feelings and emotions about life. Through the existence of Kevin, Emily is just a villain. You know, the story can force Emily to be a more nuanced character, but it doesn't have to be. Emily could have just still been a regular villain. But through the existence of Vivian, and through Vivian's creation, there is a necessity for Emily to be more complex. This can also reflect the complexity of life to a player and to the players around the table, even those who aren't playing Vivian. People, including enemies, have families, motives, and nuance. And this forms in the game out of the death of a character, but also forms in players through the death of their character. D&D is a great way to help foster empathy and self-reflection. Many times I've reflected on my own life and how I feel about people through my characters and their desires, because my characters and their desires reflect me and my desires. Death in D&D can show that enemies are complex and that failure is never really an ending, but is also a beginning or a continuation. Vivian, whether she or her player understands, is a continuation of Kevin's story. This demonstrates that when we fail and possibly give up, or worse, someone will come along and kind of finish what we've done. Or we ourselves will pick up where we left off and continue, just like the player who made Vivian after Kevin's death. This tells us the first reality of failure, that failure is never the end. Another large part of Dungeons & Dragons is, of course, dungeons. And dungeons are a loose idea in the D&D community and in D&D in general. But essentially, it's just an area of the world that is inhabited by very, very few people, if people at all, and is usually full of monsters and treasures and some type of lore or history of the world. And if you've ever played Legend of Zelda, you're probably familiar with the concept of the dungeon. They usually play a large part in the story of D&D, because if you as a DM take the time to make a dungeon and the party is forced to be in that dungeon for a long period of time, the DM needs to make the dungeon relevant. So it needs to be relevant to the story, or at least add something, or else the players are going to feel unfulfilled or feel like they've wasted time. However, if the DM can't make the dungeon, complex and full of puzzles, the dungeon will move too quickly and people really won't have fun. Again, they'll feel like, why was I in there to begin with? So this is where a core part of D&D comes in, the puzzle. Most DMs make dungeons with lots of puzzles and riddles and just all types of shenanigery that is meant to stall the player in a sense. This is an important part because it gets the player to think through everything and try to put pieces together. It's the more intellectual side of Dungeons & Dragons and not just the combat side. However, if you've seen Indiana Jones, you would know that dungeons often have traps and can cause great danger if you don't move very quickly. Think of Indiana Jones and the walls that slam down, or the first Indiana Jones movie where he's running, trying to escape from this rolling rock that's following him because it's a trap. And that's essentially Dungeons & Dragons in a nutshell. The player has to think quickly on their feet, and they'll struggle and make bad decisions, like most people will, and fail some of these puzzles, or fail aspects of these puzzles until they can fully put it together as quickly as they can. As the party goes through a dungeon, they'll fail a lot, but slowly they'll get better and better and better as they go further and further in the dungeon. That's kind of the nature of a dungeon. Indiana Jones, he's kind of an exception, but he doesn't do the best in most dungeons at first. He kind of slowly figures out, okay, I need to go this way, oh, this is related to this, and so on and so forth. So, let's say that the DM makes a dungeon dedicated to, a lost god within a fantasy world. And the party, at first, may not know that the dungeon is related to this lost god, or may not know about the lost god at all, and has very little information. And the first few puzzles the DM makes will likely be in reference to the lost god, but the party doesn't really know this. So it's not easy to figure out the puzzle compared to how easy it would be if you did know about the lost god and know what the lost god's kind of about. But as the party goes through the dungeons and fails a few puzzles, they'll slowly put together the history or lore or concept behind this lost god, which allows the puzzles to be solved quicker and quicker and quicker. This kind of denotes another reality of failure, and that's that failure is a learning opportunity if you pay attention. Failure in these cases is not as extreme as death. However, when a person fails to put together a puzzle in a desired time, or fails to solve a riddle, the person will likely think about what they did wrong or what they were missing and kind of reminisce on that, in the sense of if you're playing chess, right, and you lose a chess match, you're likely going to think about how you messed up the game, how you messed up that round of chess, and kind of know the essentials of chess that you need to put into play next time. And chess is kind of a conversation between two players. D&D is much of the same. It's a conversation between the DM and the player. It's a chess match in a sense. And although the DM should want the players to win, chess is different. Both players want to win on their own. The DM technically should work on the behalf of the players. If your DM doesn't do that, they're a bad DM. Don't play with them. But dungeons work like chess. The puzzles exist to get the party to think and to problem solve and to pick up slowly little tidbits about the history of the dungeon as they move through it. That way, once they get to the last puzzle, the puzzle may be way more complex than the first puzzle, but you'll have everything in place to know how to solve it because you would have struggled and failed throughout all those other puzzles. And this again denotes that failure is a learning opportunity if you pay attention. Chess also provides a different aspect of failure that can be applied to D&D. In D&D, many DMs create rivals for the party, and these can be groups or individuals that exist in the story to work against the party. Many people know what a rival is. They can be a competing force or even an antagonistic force, and I think this adds another layer of reality to that of failure. Let's say the party is trying to find a rare item for a king, and as soon as they find the item, a different group comes in and steals the item. Similar to the last example, a competition is similar to that of a conversation. Chess is like a conversation. And in many ways, competition in and of itself is a type of conversation. And there's a call and response of actions when one is competing against others. But the conversation of competition is different from the conversation of confusion or the conversation in relation to a puzzle. Because as you kind of will understand, failure that comes out of a competition can lead to social outcomes of like embarrassment, fear, or lack of confidence. All of these aspects can massively work against you in the next competition and can lead to more failure. And if you compete, they can cause you to be in your head too much, which is different from if you fail a puzzle. If you fail a puzzle, you might be in your head a little bit, but not to the extent of if you fail competitions. While on the flip side, if you win a competition, it's not all positive. You know, if you win a competition or succeed in competing, you may become arrogant or be overconfident or foolish. You know, and arrogance, overconfidence, and foolishness also can lead to failure in another competition and can lead to you getting outplayed because you're not looking at the fine details. So when it comes to competition, success and failure can both lead to further failure. Therefore, this kind of illuminates the third reality of failure, and that's that failure can beget more failure, but so can success. And it is important to think about competition in this light. Now, back to D&D. Let's say the party and this other group, this other team, are racing to get a rare item for the king again. And this time, the party keeps in mind how the other team was victorious against them. They keep in mind their failure, but don't allow it to keep them down or embarrassed, but to learn from those mistakes. Meanwhile, the other team, while victorious, is keeping in mind all the ways in which they could have lost the last time. So the party is keeping in mind all the ways in which they can win, and keeping in mind that they failed the last time and how to change that, while the other team, the rivals, are keeping in mind how they won and what could have happened to make them lose. That way they maximize their ability to win. Both the party and the rivals are trying to maximize their ability to win in this context. And it illuminates the next reality of failure, that failure can beget success. It's kind of interesting. Failure can lead to more failure, but it can also lead to success if you keep in mind how you failed the last time. So, when the two groups run into each other, the party and the rivals, the players and this group of NPCs that the DM made up, there is, an understanding of respective failures. Especially if the DM's a good DM and can show that through the actions of the NPCs. Leading to a greater sense of competition that can result in either winning or losing. Success is not set in stone. Just because the rivals won last time does not mean they're going to win again, because both groups are keeping in mind the reality of winning and losing, which leads to another reality of success and failure, and that's that success hinges on the knowledge that failure is possible, and in some cases hinges on the knowledge that failure is unavoidable. This is something I've learned through D&D, watching my players fight against many competing groups. They each seem to understand that success hinges on the knowledge that one can fail and that failure is possible. So through D&D, I've learned the following about the nature of failure. 1, that failure is never the end. 2, failure is a learning opportunity if you pay attention. 3, failure can beget more failure, but so can success. 4, failure can beget success. And 5, success hinges on the knowledge that failure is possible and in some cases unavoidable. These things that I somewhat knew before playing D&D were kind of brought more to life through D&D, and I assume these are things most people know and understand. However, most people are still very worried about failure and constantly talk about failure. Even I talk about failure a lot. I have a deep fear of failure and dread making every YouTube video because I feel like they're all failures and will always be failures. I have a deep fear of my academic career going nowhere, even though I'm about to start working on 2 masters in English and religion and want to be a professor down the line. I'm also a writer, which is where the English part comes in, and I write, stories and have been working on a novel for a while, and I fear that that'll be a failure. I just constantly have a deep fear of failure. And even if, all those things do turn out to be failures, my YouTube videos are failures, my novels are failure, my academic career is a failure, there's a large possibility that my failures will impact someone else and, impact them to succeed. For example, if my YouTube videos fail, it is still a possibility that one person who watched one of my videos may have been impacted in some way that led them, throughout life and eventually succeed in something, kind of like a butterfly effect. Or in the sense that failure is never the end. Every video I make kind of forces me to grow, grow in my ability to write, to create, to edit, to do more and more and more, eventually leading to better and better products, eventually leading to some type of modicum of success. In reality, this video was never fully about D&D. It's really about me grappling with the reality of failure. Matter of fact, the theme of this month of the Media Mondays of August is that of failure. This videos and the videos happening for the rest of the month are an attempt for me to accept that failure is a natural aspect of reality, and I invite you to learn and accept this as well. But you may ask, why did I explore this through D&D? Well, because D&D continues to teach me how to imagine. And this is the point of D&D. It's based in the imagination. The DM and the players must create, puzzles, enemies, and a story to engage with. The player must use their imagination and creativity to figure out ways to solve, what the DM puts before them, and use their imagination to defeat enemies and create characters. Success is similar to D&D in the fact that to succeed you need creativity and imagination. And while, this has been a meme, in reference to the current presidential candidate of the United States, VP Harris, one of her quotes that I think about a lot is, one must imagine what can be unburdened by what has been. And a lot of people laugh at that, but that's actually very philosophical in nature. Like, that's the crux of imagination. You need to imagine what can be regardless of what the past is. That is success. You must imagine yourself succeeding regardless of the failures that you've had. I think that's a really good quote. It's in many aspects very philosophical, and I can rattle off a bunch of philosophers who would like agree with that quote in nature. Camus, a few others. But one must just imagine being successful in a sense, unburdened by failure. In chess, one must imagine their opponent's next move. In sports, one must create and imagine new moves, new plays, and new actions to win. Because if a boxer or a football player were to keep doing the same old actions that have always been done, they will continue to be countered and likely lose. But if they're innovative and create new plays, new ideas, new actions, there's no counter for them yet, and it will lead to success. Dungeons & Dragons taught me this. It taught me a fundamental nature of the reality of failure, and that I need to understand that to succeed is to imagine, and failure calls one to imagine harder. So when I fail as a DM or as a player, it just means I need to think or imagine up a new way to succeed. When I fail as a person, it's the same thing. This is what D&D has really taught me. All those other 5 points, like I said, I kind of knew before D&D, but D&D really taught me that success hinges on imagination. So the next time you think you failed, you need to imagine how to succeed next time you do that endeavor. And if you don't ever want to do the endeavor, you're thinking of, there's tons of times you fail, but if you're thinking of a specific time that you failed and you're like, I don't want to do that again, well, imagine what could have went differently about that and just apply it to something else. Create your next success here and now, because that's what failure calls you to do. Well, it's a new month, and as I stated earlier, this month's theme for Media Mondays is failure. I don't fully know how that's going to shape up by the end of the month. I have a lot of ideas. Of course, I only have limited Mondays, but I want to reflect on the nature of failure and what failure often looks like in media, and what failure can tell us about media, and what media can tell us about failure, and all of that. And I'm hoping to learn more about myself and others through learning about failures, and I invite you all to do that too. And I want to overcome some of my deep fear of failure and invite you all to do that too. Philosophy Fridays, hopefully an episode will come out. YouTube is a lot more work. I knew it was a lot of work, but it takes a lot more energy than I thought it was going to out of me. Like, I knew it took a lot of work and energy, but my energy hasn't fully replenished, I guess I should say. I keep wanting to say repleted, but replenished. And philosophy naturally takes a lot of energy out of me. Like, I don't know if you guys have noticed, I put a lot of philosophy in these videos, even if I don't mention that many philosophers. Like, I didn't mention that many philosophers in this video. Philosophy takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of energy to do correctly. And a Philosophy Friday takes a lot more research. I have a lot of different Philosophy Fridays I have in the works, but none ready to fully be put out, because I just don't feel good enough about the breadth of the research in those projects quite yet. Also, there's a barrier to like education and like research and resources, in the sense that like most academic journals want you to pay, and luckily I go to school so I can get a lot of academic journals for free. It takes a long time to read them, and they may not even give you what you want, and then you might find what you need in this obscure book that you had to pay for on Amazon. It's just complicated. But Philosophy Fridays hopefully will be out soon. Hopefully the first one will be out Friday, but no promises. But I do really want to get that series started, because I do want an excuse to just talk about philosophy, kind of divorced from media, and talk about the nature of philosophy in reference to society, and talk about theology and sociology and metaphysics and all of that good stuff. And but I don't really have sources for this video. I have a few, like, I guess further reading is what I would call it, or like further research, and that's again the self-help book I referenced that's D&D themed, and then just a general D&D history book that kind of tells the history of Ernest Gary Gygax, who is, I'm telling you, he is a little controversial, but he is not the most controversial figure in D&D history. Believe it or not, there are people way more controversial than a man who once said he didn't think women could play D&D because they like essentially lack the correct faculties to play. Wild. But let me know your thoughts and critiques in the comments, be it good faith and not too hurtful. I'm a little worried about this video because a lot of the D&D community, like I said, it's very diverse, but there's a very vocal minority that is absolutely awful, worst people you'll ever encounter, weirdos, weird behavior, weird. That's the only way I can say about them. If you want to learn more about that side of the community, you know, as essentially like how toxic they can be, there's tons of YouTube videos about just bad D&D stories, and by not the story of the game, just real life people being awful, and people tell their stories about playing with very awful people. Usually they have a very specific look and personality, and I'm sure you can imagine, and they are usually the type of person who would say, I hate diversity, I hate woke, I hate DEI, that type of person. Hopefully they don't come to this video, because I am exactly everything they do not like. I am woke, I am DEI, I am diversity and inclusion. I'm diversity, equity, and inclusion itself. I'm the concept, you know, even though they're definitely just gonna say I'm DEI because I'm black. If they can't even say I'm DEI, I'm not even succeeding in what I'm doing right now. So anyway, I hope you like this video. I'm kind of rambling right now, but let me know your thoughts in the comments, and yeah.